What? This belt was new 3 seasons ago, so it should have lasted much longer. The boat doesn't have that many hours on it, so I suspect I have some type of pulley alignment issues. So stick around if you want to see how to address a pulley misalignment on an old motor. This particular OMC motor only has 3 pulleys. There's a water pump pulley, main crankshaft harmonic balancer that has a pulley in it, and then an alternator pulley. Crankshaft pulley, there's basically no way that can get out of misalignment. It's never been taken off of this motor as far as I know, but the alternator and the water pump pulley have both been taken off. The water pump pulley was taken off when the water pump was replaced, and the alternator also had to come off at that time. So I'm going to start by checking if these 2 pulleys are in line with each other, and my suspicion is that the alternator is not lined up with the water pump. The water pump pulley is basically bolted directly to the face of the water pump, so it's machine surface on the block, machine surface on the water pump, machine surface on the pulley, so there's not a whole lot that can go wrong there. The alternator is bracketed on with the bracket up here and a bracket on the bottom, and that also bolts into the block, so there's a lot of different brackets that could potentially be out of whack. So I'm going to take a look and see what I can do to figure this out. The only tool I'm going to be using for right now is just a carpenter square. So basically what you can do is you kind of line it up on the pulleys, kind of sight down past them, and see what kind of alignment you get. So right now what I'm doing is I'm going to put this directly across the face of the alternator pulley, so there's no daylight shining through there, so it's perfectly flat. And then what I want to do is get my eye in line and sight up it to the water pump pulley. And what you can see right there, and I'll put some arrows in the video, but right there you can see as you move your eye back and forth that the top of the water pump pulley peeks out before the bottom does, and you can see how far out of alignment the alternator is. So if this thing was in line, it'd be like this, and it would kind of all peek out at the same time like that. This alternator cocked. I'm going to loosen all the brackets on the alternator and see if I can figure out why it's so far out of alignment. So down here is the bolt, or the bracket that bolts the alternator to the engine block. So if there's factory paint on this hardware, that means it's still the factory install on this bracket. Nothing's moved. I'm gonna crack these bolts just to see if there's any movement in there or adjustment, because it needs to adjust a fair amount for this pulley to be lined up. But it's definitely the alternator, because I can sight it down the alternator to the crank pulley, and I can also sight it from the alternator to the water pump pulley. And I guess the good news is it's showing now is that it needs to come down, whereas before it needed to come up. So I think I might be able just to loose those bolts that bolt that bracket to the block and use that little bit of alignment to put this thing where it needs to be. So that's what I'm going to try. I think I have this alternator alignment issue sorted out enough where I can put a new fresh belt on and not have to worry about it. Been buying these Gates Super HC. They're a 3VX belt. For this particular model, it's a 40 inch. It's a 3/8 40 inch. These are supposed to be like high horsepower V-belts. So this belt's not exactly cheap. It's not, you know, it's not like a $5 V-belt. It's 20 bucks or so. So I would prefer not to have it shred every 3 years. But the bigger thing that is a huge pain in the rear, so on these old motors, the select trim unit is right here, and what happens is there's a worm gear and a mechanism here, and this lifts the whole front of the motor up and down to trim the boat. Mine doesn't work because the electric motor is shot. It needs rebuilt, and you know, that's on the list for some time. But the huge pain in the rear part of it is this unit blocks the 2 bolts that are right here, and since mine doesn't work, I can't lift the motor to get access to those bolts. So normally you could pretty easily lift the motor, take all 4 bolts out, put a block under the oil pan, drop the motor back down, unbolt these, zip zaps up, easy peasy. My task without the trim is a little harder. I still have to take those bolts out, but I have to monkey the motor around. I got to kind of jack it up and hand crank this thing down. It's the only way to get a new belt on there, and you can't run the motor without a belt because it won't charge the battery and it'll overheat. So I don't really have a choice. I'm starting to think that maybe a replacement for this trim unit needs to happen sooner rather than later. So I got this thing tied off. It's just taking some of the motor weight. I'm able to reach in here and unloosen these bolts the rest of the way by hand. So more than all the weight should be off this motor. So this is where the tilt system would come in handy, because these are the bolts that I can't get out, and they're also the bolts that are in the way of this belt passing around behind it. So I kind of have to jiggle things around and keep my fingers out of the way and get this belt fed through there. You know, I'll try not to get it oily or tear it or do anything like that. So hopefully I can jiggle this belt around and get it through there. Oily and greasy. That's on there. Make sure that's clean. Let's line back up. Alright, so belt's in. I need to do the tighten on the belt. Check it out, but that wear that was on the back of this bracket, I'm looking at where these mounting holes are, and that's the edge of the hole. It's not lined up here at all, but it looks like this is in the correct position related to the engine. It must have been stuffed back a bit before. All of this stuff I made up because the floor was so rotten in this boat when I replaced it that there was no way for me to get any measurements. The engine was basically sitting down in the bilge, and all this was completely rotted away, and there was just no measurements. So I pretty much made all this stuff up. And it worked out okay, but obviously this is kind of in the wrong spot. So I need to get a drill bit and drill some new pilot holes here before I run those lag bolts back in.
Thanks for checking out the video. The main point of this was to try to show what's required to change one of these fan belts on one of these old boats that has the select trim unit. It's not as simple as just taking a belt off and putting a belt on. You've got to remove some bracketry, and it can be a little bit more of an involved task. And this is just to give some people understanding on why you might get charged a lot of money just to change a fan belt on a boat. It's depending on the model of your boat, it's not always as simple as just taking the belt off and putting a new one on. Not like a car anyway. So far this belt's been on about 3 weeks. So the boat's got maybe 6 hours of runtime on it since then. As far as I can tell, the belt's not wearing as bad as it was before. It's still getting a lot more wear on it than I would expect for only 6 hours. So I still think there is a little bit of an alignment problem. This whole area would have been caked with black powder, and that black powdery stuff was the belt. So I don't see as much of that. So hopefully I get more than 3 seasons out of this next belt. 3 seasons for me is not a lot of hours. Thanks for watching the video on the old Sea Ray here. I hope that was informative on how you can align one of these alternator pulleys, or if you're having some wear, what kind of things you can do to try to check what's going on. If you like the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you haven't yet, please check out some of my playlists. I've got a playlist on this boat. It's probably about 8 or 9 videos at this point, so go check that out if you're interested in these old boats.